first question is about difference in leadership in business and in philanthropy. In business, you have to achieve the positive bottom line, and this is the main result. In philanthropy, you as a leader have to achieve a positive social impact, social effect. Is there any difference between these leaderships in philanthropy and in business?
You know, Roman, I actually agree with you that I think there is not much difference between a good business leader and a good philanthropic leader. In fact, early in my career, I ran a nonprofit organization for 2 years. I was the head of something called the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition, and so we led bicycle advocacy efforts in the state of Massachusetts in the U.S. And it was a great learning experience for me, but it was actually through running this organization that I realized how many similarities there were between being the executive director of a nonprofit and running a business. And it actually gave me the confidence later to leave the organization and start my own business. But I feel like the skill sets are very parallel. You have to be an entrepreneurial thinker, you have to be enterprising, and you have to make sure that you are driving results. And of course, even when you're running a nonprofit, you still have to be profitable in the sense of making enough money to keep your operations going. So I think there's far more similarities than differences.
And what about empathy? Is empathy a possible difference between leaderships in business and in philanthropy, or not necessarily?
I think good business leaders are empathetic toward their customers. I think it would be hard to stay in business if you weren't. You genuinely want to help your clients and customers, and that's why they're willing to give you money. For philanthropic organizations, obviously you're driven by that cause, but I think that again, it's such a fine line. It's really just a question of emphasis rather than a difference of real substance.
Okay, thank you. There are leaders who are just good, and there are leaders who are, I call them thought leaders, people who are driving the world, people who are creating changes, people who are setting new trends. What, in your view, is so specific about those leaders, the thought leaders, as compared to regular leaders?
Yes, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question, and in fact, my second book, Stand Out, is really about how to establish yourself as a thought leader or a recognized expert in your industry. And what I believe the difference is, you can certainly be a great leader and run your organization well, but the only people who know you are the people who you directly touch. Your staff knows you're a great leader, your donors do, maybe your clients, but it's inherently a limited impact because the world doesn't necessarily know about it. But if you are a thought leader, you are someone who is sharing your ideas in the public sphere so that other people can benefit from your knowledge and all of the experiences you've had as a leader. You do that by speaking at conferences, by writing in journals, by making an effort to be interviewed and be active in the press. And those are things that are helpful for your organization because you're obviously able to leverage that into more exposure to donors, more attention for your cause. But if you are doing it the right way, you are also sharing insights that can help other nonprofit leaders because you're making the road easier for them. You're saving them the trouble of making their own mistakes because you're sharing the lessons so that they can go faster.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. My next question is about leaders who come from business to philanthropy. In your books, like Reinventing You, for example, you think a lot about what should be done to make the career that suits you really well, the best career. And business professionals often think of the nonprofit sector as something where the job is really more meaningful, and I really want to do this job, but I have restrictions and fears and limitations with regard to the low income, with regard to the to many uncertainties, with regard to a new environment. What would you recommend to those leaders who are thinking about it but still are in the process of decision making?
Yes, but I think that it is certainly true that on average, nonprofit salaries are lower than in the corporate world. I mean, that's a reality that we have to deal with. But there are a large number of professionals that have had long enough careers and been successful enough that money no longer has to be the primary driver of what they're doing. And so if you are in a position where you have that flexibility, where money can be a variable but not the variable, then I think considering a nonprofit career is a fantastic thing to do. I mean, for many professionals, they may have enjoyed what they did, but they're diverse people. They have a lot of different interests. And for anyone, if you've been in the same career for 20 or 30 years, you probably want new challenges. You want to explore new things. And if there is something that you care about, whether it is a personal passion like sports, or it may be a cause that has touched you, maybe someone in your family has had a disability or has been touched with cancer or something like that, then it has great depth of meaning. And so you can begin to think about your career in its totality as a portfolio, and how do you express yourself best through the work that you do. And I think that's actually very exciting to be able to think, how can I take the skills that I've worked so many years and worked so hard to build and apply them in a place where I can learn new things and I can help people.
Dori, I'm convinced that non-profit people in non-profits work under much higher pressure than people in business, because they, as you just told, they may face some difficult personal stories, they are responsible for other people's money, they have lots of reporting and they have to raise funds and so on and so forth. And there are leaders who often take all this responsibility on their shoulders, and it all leads to a burnout of these leaders, but they still keep working because they're responsible, they cannot leave their non-profit, and they still keep working hard. But it can be really damaging both for the leader and for the organization. What would be your advice to these leaders who are in the burnout stage?
I think what you're talking about, Roman, is very powerful and very important. And I know from having been a nonprofit leader myself that the stress is enormous. I mean, I have had a lot of different careers in my life. I was a spokesperson on a presidential campaign. That was stressful. I mean, I was working enormous hours and it was a very high pressure job, but it was less stressful than running the nonprofit. For the past 13 years, I've had my own business. I am 100% responsible for bringing in my income. That is less stressful than running the nonprofit. At an existential level, running this organization was the most stressful thing that I ever did in my life, because I felt such a high degree of responsibility for my staff and for the donors of the organization to keep the organization going and doing positive things. So I think you are absolutely right. I would say that there's probably two recommendations or pieces of advice that I would have. One is, I think there are a number of foundations, at least in the States and hopefully perhaps in Russia, that have started sabbatical programs for nonprofit executive directors, where they recognize the stress that people are under and actually will fund periodic breaks and time off for nonprofit leaders to train and to learn and to renew themselves. And I think that's actually extremely valuable and something that I endorse. The second thing is that probably the best thing that an individual nonprofit leader can do is to make sure that institutionally they have the support that they need. And so even though in the moment there's always a million fires that have to be put out and a lot of urgent things, the things that have the most value long-term are taking the time to invest in hiring a good deputy and training that person well. And in the moment, it takes a lot of time and effort, but to have somebody that can relieve some of the administrative burdens from you, and also working very hard at board development, because ultimately the biggest pressure is money. And if you are responsible essentially as executive director for bringing in all the money, which you should not be, that's not really your role, but nonetheless, if you have a weak board, that is your role, it's just terrifying. And so working to build up a strong board to help you with the fundraising so that you can concentrate on other areas is one of the best things that you can spend your time doing.
Thank you very much. I like especially the idea of a sabbatical. It really appeals to me. Yeah. How do you see difference between self-promotion and personal brand, if there is any difference? And also, in your view, how ethical is it to use your personal brand while being involved in solving really difficult social issues like poverty, social injustice, homeless people, and so on?
So I'll tackle the second question first. I actually believe that if you are coming from the right place, if you have good motives, then it is perfectly appropriate to raise your profile and be active and visible, because when you do, it brings attention to the cause. It is a fact of human nature that when you are talking about a large, complicated, abstract problem, oh, the homeless. Well, I mean, it seems complicated and unfathomable to regular people. But if you can be an articulate spokesperson for that cause, and if you can bring that to light, there is no reason because of some false sense of modesty that you shouldn't use the platform that you have. I think that if your goal is to be helpful in a genuine way, that's a good thing that you should be doing. In terms of the difference between self-promotion and personal branding, many people use the terms as synonyms. For me, I would say I am a little more skeptical of the term self-promotion because it does seem to connote in a kind of aggressive way, you know, oh, look at me, which I think is not really the goal. Personal branding is a term that I prefer in the sense that everyone has a brand. I mean, people think something about you, obviously. The question is, are you going to be strategic about what that is? It doesn't mean that you have to be constantly seeking attention or constantly telling people how amazing you are, but it does mean that it's useful to think about it. It's useful to be thoughtful about what you spend your time doing, what you spend your time speaking about, who you associate with, to ensure that your true talents are more likely to be recognized.
In another book of yours, Standout Networking, you propose different strategies for networking, independent on whether you're an extrovert or introvert. Are these strategies subject to modification depending on the culture? For example, the Russians are more reserved and networking is really seen as something artificial. And the second part of the question is about charities. How are these strategies applicable to non-profit workers, to fundraisers especially, when they have to approach people for business and it may look intrusive?
Yes. So I have two thoughts about that, Roman. The first is that I think looking at the term networking, the actual word, is useful because I think that sometimes people have strange connotations about it. I mean, when we say networking, people assume we mean, oh, it's going to be a transaction, I'm meeting people so I can get something out of them, then of course it feels weird, because it is weird. That's not how humans relate to each other in a normal way, and it feels uncomfortable, and no one really wants to do that. But when I think about networking, I mean, to me, it is a neutral word, because really what I think it's about is relationship building. I think that the key, I mean, Russians might not like networking as it's conceptualized, but Russians like building relationships. Russians like making friends. And if you think of networking that way, then I think it becomes powerful. I mean, one of the pieces of advice that I actually have, and I think that this will hopefully make networking feel more normal for people, I actually have a rule that when I meet somebody, I do not ask them for a favor for a year, okay? And I think that's a rule everybody should have, because if you meet somebody and the next day is, oh, nice to meet you, Roman, so great to meet you. Hey, will you buy something from me? I mean, you feel used by that process. And so I like to just say, you know what, it's off the table. I don't even want to ask for anything. I want to get to know someone in a real and substantive way. And I do that. And later, down the road, I mean, once we are good friends, then it's appropriate to ask a friend for a favor. I would do you a favor. And if we're friends, you would want to do me a favor. It's not a transaction anymore. It's part of a relationship. But when I first meet people, I just don't even want to deal with what can I do for you, what can you do for me. I think that's a better way to look at it. And wait, what was the second part?
About charities and fundraisers, because
yes.
Networking is an important part of their function.
So for charities and nonprofits, I think here's the key. People feel weird being approached for money when there's a little dance around it. I'll give you an example. Someone invited me to dinner at her house, and she cooked this elaborate dinner. I mean, it was over the top. It was a 3-course dinner, a 4-course dinner. It took hours. It was so much preparation. And she started, as the night went on, getting more and more and more nervous. And I thought, what's going on here? Because I thought she was inviting me over for a friendly dinner. No, she was inviting me over to ask me for money. And it felt like a setup. It felt like, oh, you're doing all this elaborate thing to ask me for money, and it's like a trick, right? And I didn't like how that felt. But I think that if it's straight up, if you're just saying to people, look, I'm a fundraiser for a charity. We would love it if you gave money to this charity. If you don't feel comfortable, that's okay. But just so you know, if you want to, that would be great. You just let people know where they stand. The problem becomes where it's like, oh, is Roman hanging out with me because he wants to be my friend or because he wants something? You never want the person to feel that way. You want to be 100% clear up front about what hat you're wearing, and when you do that, it takes care of a lot of problems.
The last question is personally about you. You already mentioned your career in the non-profit sector, but do you support currently any philanthropic causes? And if yes, what role leadership of a non-profit plays for you? Do you look at the leader before you give a donation, before you contribute something, or it's not on your agenda in this case?
Yes. So when I lived in Massachusetts a number of years ago, I was very active in a number of charitable organizations. So I was on the advisory board for the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for nearly a decade. And I was also a member of the advisory board, and then subsequently the co-chair of the advisory board for something called Fenway Community Health, which was the largest healthcare center for lesbian and gay people in the United States. And so those were both very cool charities that I loved being active in. Since I've moved to New York, I still donate money to those charities, although I'm less involved because I'm no longer living there. And so I'm actually beginning right now, I've lately been spending a lot of time with the theater. And so I am just starting to really look around and sort of make some strategic evaluations about where to get more involved. But my plan over the next couple of years in New York is to get more involved in donating and becoming active in theatrical charities.
Are you considering leadership as an important decision-making factor for you, or it's rather about the cause itself and about the charity public image and not about the specific leader?
So for me, in terms of my initial involvement, the things that I look at, certainly first is the nature of the cause that it's helping. Above and beyond that, I will survey people in my network about the organization. Is it viewed as effective? Is it viewed as doing the job well? I don't specifically get down to the granular level of looking at the leadership until I'm more involved. And then at that point, once I'm a donor, I have a little bit more of a window into understanding who the leader is and does it seem like they have a good job. And so I think in terms of making the initial donation, it's not really a question of looking at the leader, but the cause will get me in the door. But in terms of whether I get more involved, in terms of whether I join a board or an advisory board, at that point it becomes very relevant how the leader is, because I'm going to need to interact with them and essentially be making a much stronger vote of confidence about the nature of the organization.
Right. Dori, thank you so much for your time, for your valuable inputs, for your thoughts, and enjoy the rest of your time in Moscow, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Roman. It's great to speak with you.